folks have to actually have a thoughtful conversation about the future of kind of rural America, and no better place to have that than right here at Alma College. So I'm going to kind of take a slightly different tack than when Jason teed it up a little bit. I want to actually start with a hypothesis that there's not a single major problem facing the state of Michigan, this region of Michigan, the nation as a whole, or the globe, in its entirety, that doesn't have as part of the solution better management of our natural resources. And it's easy, to kind of think globally, act locally, I mean, these kind of cliches that come up. But I would argue right now that the biggest crises we face, right, whether that's public health crises in places, a climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis, issues around immigration, all of these are a result, in many ways, of this massive imbalance in the way that we actually interact with our natural resources. Right now, the federal government spends less than 1% of its entire budget on natural resource conservation. 1%. We increased the Defense Department budget by about $60 billion last year. That's twice as much as the entire budgets of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Interior, the U.S. Forest Service, the NOAA, all combined. It's just not something we prioritized. And I think as a result, we have always kind of had this challenge of kind of showing relevance in these bigger policy debates. And so what I want, we're going to have a lot of conversation today about the Pine River, about nutrient management, about precision agriculture, about manure management, about all kinds of things we can do to both clean up our waterways and reduce emissions. But at the end of the day, I think we should be part of a bigger frame. And we have to talk about how do we actually kind of rebuild the kind of rural economy in this country. And my hypothesis, the second part of it, is that there is no way to solve the big challenges facing this state or this country without revitalizing rural America. And again, in DC right now, that's it's an aspiration that a lot of people talk to. But I kind of follow the Vice President Biden's kind of old adage: you want to show somebody their priorities, look at their budget. We're not investing in smart ways, and frankly, a lot of the investments we make in rural America are actually impoverishing rural America by pushing folks to take actions that produce very little economic return compared to other alternatives. And I'll get back to that in just a moment. But in terms of this bigger picture frame, I would argue that if you think about the big things that are being talked about right now in the presidential debate or in the Michigan governor's race last year, things around healthcare. We talk a lot about prescription drug prices and access to healthcare. We don't actually talk about how people get sick, right? And a lot of that is toxics and other pollutants in the natural environment. One of the challenges that we are facing across the country right now is the nitrate pollution in waterways that's contributing to all kinds of kind of perverse health outcomes in kids. And yet we'll spend so much more on trying to treat the illness after it's occurred than trying to take the preventative steps. That kind of ounce of prevention is often missed, and instead we spend billions of dollars and trillions of dollars on that pound of cure. And so again, it's easy to kind of think about today's conference as a environmental and kind of economic conversation, but it's also a public health conversation. One of the other big topics right now in this country is around immigration, right? And one of the things I've said to some of my colleagues is that if you look at the places where you're seeing this massive displacement of populations, it's mostly places that the natural resources have been absolutely decimated. So we're not seeing a lot of folks try to enter the country through the southern border coming from Costa Rica and Brazil, or Belize, or Brazil for that matter. Brazil's got different issues that we'll get to. It's an early morning. The places that have healthy natural resources, places that have cleaner water, more fruitful agricultural land, a more diversified economy, are obviously stronger and not seeing these kind of crises. You compare that to the Northern Triangle right now, where you're seeing massive degradation of soils, kind of the rule of law kind of falling apart. You see folks from the cartels taking the most arable land, and all of a sudden creating this kind of economic collapse. But there's an environmental piece to that that's at the heart of that conversation. And it's not just unique to there. Think about in the U.S., right? We're not that far, from places like Flint, but we don't talk about the rural water crises in this country, where folks, increasingly are unable to drink the water, or spending just thousands of dollars through filtration systems to try to make sure they can remove the nitrates or other toxics or pharmaceuticals or God knows what else that we're not even testing for. And so, again, I think it's easy to kind of separate this conversation from some of the bigger themes that are facing the country and the world right now. But I would argue that we can't solve these other issues unless we get at the heart of this question before us today, which is how do we restore our natural resources? And so when Jerry invited me to come, I was excited because I think it's a conversation that frankly doesn't take place a lot. You know, in Washington, D.C., where I spend way too much time in the awful swamp that is there, a lot of the conversation around like agriculture, for example, isn't really about kind of the benefits for the family farm, the kind of local producer. You know, it's kind of these corporate battles among, you know, the oil interests fighting against like the ag interests, right? But it's on the corporate side. I mean, we're not often having real conversations about how, in many ways, we're pushing folks to farm, you know, the subsidy or farm, you know, kind of the government program, a mandate like the ethanol mandate, which is actually producing fairly low profit, kind of very low kind of quality, low goods that have a lower value than other alternatives that folks could be farming without that kind of policy infrastructure around it. And what I mean by that is, you know, right over here, Jerry was telling me just a few minutes ago, you know, there's a biodiesel plant. And again, it creates some good jobs, and I get that. But it takes 4 times more energy to produce a gallon of biodiesel from there, between the amount of time it takes to get there and everything else, than it does the amount of energy you get on the output side. On the other side, again, there's a lot of good jobs there. But imagine the kind of the deadweight loss that could be invested in other ways that create more wealth for the community and frankly keep more of that wealth here. And I know it's hard to say, right? I'm sure there's folks that benefit from different parts of that industry. You know, I was just pheasant hunting in Iowa the other day, and a lot of folks are saying, look, we don't have a choice right now. Because given the trade war, you know, kind of they've screwed up commodity markets around the globe, so we can't sell these different places. So if we don't have these price supports that are kind of government mandates, we don't have a way to kind of make sure we can kind of feed our family. And that's the unfortunate, these kind of these unintended consequences of fairly well-intentioned policies, at least some cases, that have kind of gone awry, and I think are just impoverishing communities across the country. And again, I don't want to kind of start the morning on a down note, but I do think you have to get at these kind of economic inequities and I'm beginning to understand kind of how capital flows, basically taking value out of rural America into, you know, corporations or into government, is really at the heart of many of the challenges local communities are facing right now. So again, I mean, that's not a, you know, not a popular position to say, but at the end of the day, unless we figure out ways to have local communities basically benefiting from the amazing services they're providing, if those values aren't being kind of recaptured in some way, we're going to continue to see this impoverishment of kind of rural communities across the country. When you think about the clean air we breathe, right? You think about the clean water that, you know, most folks can drink. A lot of that's because of natural resource stewardship in rural places. Yet very little of that money kind of comes back to the rural communities. And so how we kind of redesign policy to make sure that those resources are actually being kind of recognized for the values they create is a huge kind of public policy opportunity, challenge, and need at the same time. You know, right now, back to that 1% I mentioned on the federal government, we know that we're putting money in having healthier forests. And this doesn't mean kind of lock them up and keep them away. I want actively managed, you know, well-managed, you know, forests that are in production. We know that if they're managed well, that you reduce fire risks. You know that we have more clean water, we have better habitat for species, all the species that the National Wildlife Federation works on. But for the most part, the average forester in this country, the average, you know, kind of forest product industry company isn't compensated for really anything but the board fee, right? They're not compensated for the clean air that they're producing. They're not compensated for the most part for the clean water they're producing. They're not compensated for the wildlife value. Maybe they squeeze out a few hunts, you know, get some folks to go hunt grouse or quail. But at the end of the day, they're not being compensated for all the values they're providing. And so I would encourage folks to be thinking about how do we monetize some of those values that are being created? How do we incentivize the investments that would help clean up the Pine River here? You know, and I frankly, I don't think we can regulate our way out of these problems. You know, the Clean Water Act was not designed really to deal with runoff pollution, non-point source pollution, to the extent that it was designed for the power of the sewage plants and the industrial facilities. But we're only investing a fraction of nothing in water quality compared to other kind of things in the federal budget. And so one of the big takeaways, and again, not that money is the answer to everything, but leveraging money to invest in water quality, knowing that it has a huge economic return, knowing that it can create, you know, thousands of jobs in this county, knowing it can create, you know, hundreds of thousands of jobs across the state, is an absolute game changer. And these are good jobs. These are jobs that can't be outsourced. They're jobs that pay well. But we're not really spending a lot. Even if you think about, you know, kind of the battle over infrastructure in the state, a lot of it's about roads, and fix the damn roads, and I saw the signs, we all heard the chants from across the entire country, even though that's obviously still kind of stuck in the legislature. At the end of the day, the water infrastructure in the state needs equal billing. And obviously it's part of that bigger package, but it's a fraction of and it doesn't make the debate at the top level. We spent a lot of time in the Federation working with the former mayor of Flint, Karen Weaver, trying to get enough money to Flint to rebuild the pipes. But there's 3,000 Flints across the country that are drinking, kind of contaminated water, and for the most part, because the testing isn't even there to know whether or not it's clean. And so, again, it gets back to priorities. And we spent a lot of money, trying to restore the Great Lakes, and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is absolutely amazing. We're not doing enough upstream, though. And we're not doing stuff outside the kind of immediate water bodies to think about not just the surface waters, but think about the groundwaters. And so one of the things I'd be encouraging folks to think about is how do we leverage public dollars as a way to create markets for private investment as well as kind of monetize some of these private values to make sure that folks are getting the resources that frankly they deserve for the services they're providing. I would love to see a farm in this country have the crops that they want to plant based on what they want to shop, what they want to put into the marketplace, what they think you can get a good return on, and then also get credit for the carbon that they're sequestering in the soils because of the practices that also have a revenue stream for maybe some hunts that they're able to do on land that isn't quite as productive that could support a range of species, but they're also getting revenue for water quality improvements that are avoiding downstream investments in wastewater treatment plants or drinking water plants because of the kind of the cleaner water coming from upstream. I would love to see the average farmer in this country have 3 or 4 different revenue streams coming up just for the ecological services they provide and make those markets really function, really capture those externalities, and then reward people for removing them. That gets tricky though, right? When the average farmer, and again, I'll go back to my experience in Plymouth County the other day in Iowa, they're saying, look, we're getting killed right now, right? The trade war has been a disaster. Like we can't sell, our commodity prices have gone to hell. We're basically getting paid to not do anything. And in some cases, we have government kind of policies whipsawing us around the ethanol mandate and other policies. We just want to be able to put food on the table. And when you're saying there's all these potential revenue streams, like that's great for my kids or my grandkids, but I don't know how that helps me today when I'm worried about foreclosure. And so there's a realism that I think we have to bring to this conversation. Obviously, the economics here are a little different, but not dramatically different than other parts of the country. But this is a conversation that's not taking place in a serious way in DC, right? I mean, the vibrato, and I won't get into the Twitter feeds and everything else on all sides. It's just too early for that. And my little one, I have a 2-year-old, she's not sleeping right now, so I get a little cranky when I think about it. But there's a lot of folks that are hurting. I heard a statistic the other day that suicides among farmers in this country are at the highest levels since the 1920s. The number of foreclosures is at a higher rate than any time since the 70s. And yet, that's not a major part of the conversation. And so the conversation you're having here at Alma is incredibly important because, frankly, if we can find solutions that work here, there are solutions that we can export across the entire country. I do think it gets back to making sure that folks are really rewarded for the work that they're doing. And right now, like I was Secretary of Natural Resources in Delaware. I was this kind of kid secretary who had to learn the chicken industry kind of from the bottom up. And the thing that was amazing to me learning about that industry was that the growers, the guys that had the chicken houses, the guys that were doing the work, received such little value in terms of the overall, kind of by the time you saw that chicken breast at Walmart or the local grocery store, received just cents on the dollar. And even though they were creating, I would argue, most of the value. They were basically being forced to buy feed and different kinds of materials from the producer. They had very little negotiating power because frankly they weren't always working with each other to try to drive up prices. They were kind of having the prices driven down all the time. Yet at the same time, all the regulatory risk fell on those guys, all of it. So if the state agency came after them for a water quality violation, it was coming after the individual farmer. The CAFO regulations, all these different regulations kind of fell on the individual farmer, who frankly was getting the least, kind of smallest slice of the pie despite taking the biggest risk. The average politician in DC has no idea that that's the way that most of these guys are treated. And it's not just in corn, chicken, right? I mean, it's a lot of the livestock, but you're also seeing it increasingly on the vegetable side as well. We need to figure out ways to have policies that reward folks that are going to love the land, live on the land, and kind of grow the food that feeds America, and not have all that just kind of go kind of to the corporate side of the equation. And again, I don't want to sound like an economic populist, but like this is not a big enough part of the conversation right now. I mean, I haven't really heard any presidential candidates talking about the inequities in the ag communities They want to talk about regenerative agriculture and talk about how agriculture is 10% of the climate solution, which is great and all true. But we have an economic crisis right now that we have to get at if we're going to try to have the resource that we need to deal with some of the natural resource issues that we have right here. And they're connected. So I apologize. Normally I'm a little more upbeat, and I have my kind of series of jokes I can tell about, the insanity in DC and, listening to, talking about buying Greenland and all these other kind of things that are coming out. But you all are having a serious conversation. And I just wanted to tee it up in a serious way, because I think if we don't figure out ways to make sure that the value that's being created by rural communities in this country is basically staying within those communities, I don't know how we fix some of the bigger inequities that we have. And again, it's not a fun topic to get into, right? But at the same time, it's an incredibly important one, because there's just a lot of folks that are hurting right now. And I don't want to be in a position where we're dependent on other countries to import food from. I don't want to be in a position where we don't have that food security. I don't want to be in a position where our trade imbalance gets worse and worse. I want folks on the landscape. We're living at a time where we got kind of these three big challenges, right? We got this kind of climate crisis that we're facing, we got a biodiversity crisis that we're facing, and we have fewer and fewer people spending time outdoors, which I think is contributing to our healthcare cost explosion and just our general happiness and kind of crankiness as we're trading time in the natural world and time in a virtual world. Solving all those issues requires having incredibly vital rural communities across the country. You can't solve the climate crisis in this country. You can't get even close to net zero emissions in this country unless we have massive investment in sequestration and improved practices on the landscape of both agriculture and forestry. You just can't get there. The math doesn't work. We're going to need to replant, we're going to need to change practices, we're going to need to do all kinds of stuff. I want to make sure that's done in a way that's investing and not regulated, right? I want to make sure that's done through practices that make people want to participate because they see the economic return, they see the long-term kind of sustainability of the business operation more than they feel like the heavy hand of Washington or Lansing coming down on them. On the second piece, on the biodiversity side, I think this is a scary piece. And Jerry and I spent a lot of time talking about this. Right now, about 1/3 of all wildlife species in this country are at heightened risk of extinction. And the scary thing about that is that we've done a better job saving the stuff that we hunt and fish than any other place in the world. There are enough white-tailed deer, at least in my neighborhood. We've got some insanity going on in Lansing right now. We're trying to bait, but that's a different issue. Duck populations are good. Duck populations are up 56% compared to 40 years ago. There's a report that came out a few weeks ago talking about there's 3 billion fewer birds than in 1970. And the one highlight of that was that ducks and waterfowl populations were up, right? The wild turkey populations were way up. Everything else is down. Songbirds, shorebirds, grassland birds. And that gets back to the lack of habitat. But these issues are connected, right? So as we move towards more kind of monocrops and not having many buffer strips and not having as much kind of diversity of plant types on the landscape, we're losing that critical habitat that's necessary from everything from the monarch butterfly that's trying to make the journey from Mexico to Canada, and the grassland bird that just depends on healthy prairies. And frankly, Michigan's in a place to actually lead on this. Politically, you have beautifully alignment between Senator Stabenow and Peters and Debbie Dingell and Fred Upton and just you're really well-positioned folks to get conservation and really, I think, care about it in a deep way you might not always agree on the way it manifests itself. But the biodiversity in Michigan is incredible, right? If you think about the entire state, it is kind of a microcosm of this entire region. And frankly, there's more opportunities to restore habitat here than other places because the level of degradation is actually less than in some other places. And even as I was flying over today, you still see more habitat on the corners of center pivots and center pivot farm grounds and the like. But it's a huge issue. But the biggest thing that scares me about this isn't actually the science, it's the human side. Because when you think about that 1/3 of species, that 80% of folks are living in cities, and they're less connected to the land, all of a sudden, they're more likely to see, a moose on their kid's onesie than they are actually see a moose in nature, right? We've had an entire generation of folks that wildlife kind of experiences are on pages of a magazine like Ranger Rec, and you all should subscribe because that helps us. Than they are to see species in the wild, right? And you're kind of in a blessed area here, right? Because all surrounding, you just have amazing natural resources, and the state parks here are amazing, and obviously, the further north you go, the better it gets in many ways. But we need to have this connection, right, to nature. So both on climate, there's a sequestration value and kind of improving managers. You can't get there without rural America. On the biodiversity side, we can't get there without more habitat. This is everything from kind of restoring habitat to connecting habitat. A lot of the challenge around migration, like species don't have the amount to move. It's what water. A lot of the species that are in trouble right now in this country are aquatic. We do a good job, again, with some of the big things that we like to fish. Not doing nearly as well, things like Asian carp that we just got killed. It's small Satan fish that it's going to eat everything if we're not careful. Yeah, just need a massive eradication strategy, even though there's been some great work there. And then the third one is kind of this children in nature deficit. I think is also a crisis. And I think it's connected to the other one. This is where I think, the students that come to an amazing liberal arts school like Alma, have the opportunity to enjoy the outdoors even more so than some folks that are more urban environments. And I think making sure that there are opportunities to kind of connect with nature for folks that maybe didn't grow up in this region, maybe grew up in a more urban environment. But right now, the average American kid is spending 50 hours a week in front of some kind of screen. It's more than a full-time job. And that's not including the 30 hours a week during school, and 40 hours a week during school. I mean, that's just a lot of time staring at screens. And that's time that we all spent growing up, playing in streams and building forts and, playing in forests. And I mean, just the time we spent outdoors from sun up to sundown and, the dinner bell would ring. That's not the common experience anymore. I joke sometimes that if I let my 2-year-old or 7-year-old do that now, I'd probably get a call from social services for being a derelict parent. If they were just kind of being a free-range child, where that was our experience growing up. And hopefully, at least in this part of the country, hopefully more kids can do that than maybe some other places. But again, that disconnect from nature, and the only places that are kind of have the opportunity to do it at scale right now are some of the more rural communities. And so it's a long way of saying we need the Rural Michigan Initiative to succeed. The ideas that you're forging aren't just going to help clean up the Pine River. They're not just going to create policies for the city and the county and the state legislature. The ideas that you're going to be generating, the experts you're going to hear from the discussion that will ensue, frankly, are needed, they're replicable, and hopefully scalable across the country. I think there's a battle right now for the soul of the country, and it's not about Republicans and Democrats. It's about whether or not we're going to value our natural resources and whether or not we're going to create a legacy of stewardship that allows future generations to thrive. I mean, I'm absolutely confident if we have healthier natural resources, we can solve the climate crisis, we can solve the biodiversity crisis, we can have lower healthcare costs and have a bunch of good work overseas as well. And we can frankly have a country, and I love that quote from before, kind of make the country that we need. Make the country that's going to set us up for success in the future. There is no way to solve the challenge of the 21st century without a robust, incredibly thoughtful, forward-thinking, kind of rural initiative. And so I'm just incredibly grateful to all of you for taking the time. I know you have many demands on your time. The fact that you're all here, wanting to engage, wanting to learn, participate, says a lot. We have to change the economics. We have to change the values, and we have to basically convince people that the solutions in this country, frankly, in some ways, kind of going back to the future, is learning from our past to make sure we have a sustainable future in the future. I'm honored to be a part of this. We have a bunch of folks on my team that are here that I wanted to mention really quick, so as questions come up, ways we can help. Julie Sibbing, who runs our agriculture programs over here. Andy Foxbaum, who runs kind of all the affiliate countries in the back. And, Andy's one of the architects of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. I saw Frank Salazzi somewhere. There's Frank. Frank kind of does a lot of organizing in this region. Is Gail here too? Gail? Who else is here? Who else is here? What am I forgetting? Laura's here too. And then our state affiliate here is Michigan United Conservation Clubs. Amazing. Amy Trotter's here from there as well as her name over here. We want to be a robust part of this conversation. And my very last thought before I open the Q&A. I know that sometimes in some of these conversations, kind of environmental groups get a bad rap. There have been horribly short-sighted decisions, litigation strategies, things that were not sufficiently collaborative that have, unfortunately, I think, strained a lot of relationships between conservation groups and rural communities across this country. The National Wildlife Federation actually prides itself on being one of the most, probably the most bipartisan, nonpartisan, collaborative organizations in the country. And our goal is basically to be a constructive part and a very collaborative part of these conversations. I'm not convinced that we can solve the big challenges by basically having one side fighting against another. We got to find collaborative conservation outcomes that come to these kind of conversations. So we want to be, a willing partner in this. I got as many Republican members in the Federation as I do Democratic members. We got about 6 million members nationwide. And frankly, I think they're just fed up with politicians yelling at each other and they want to find solutions. You're all here because you want to find solutions, and I'm honored to be part of that. Thank you very much for having me this morning.